Sinaloa, whatever cartel typically has to take 6% of all of the hundreds of millions or billions of cash dollars they make in numerous cartel crimes, whether it be weed, fentanyl, human child sex, gun running, whatever they're into, and there's a bunch of other stuff they've added. The Chinese said, hey, we'll launder for less, and you cut us a break and get us those precursors we need, right? And they started to exchange, and it was 5% if you launder through the Chinese groups, and then it was 4%. And as of maybe 3-4 months ago, I'm told it's 0%. Mexicans, cartels are laundering their money for no fee through the Chinese, however they're doing that, and it's happening right here all over the country. And we're just like watching this happen, and guys like you and me and your old agency and mine, we're fighting the fight as best we can within policy, right? Within resources allowed, and we know what we're doing. We're playing whack-a-mole at best.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
We cut through the partisan talking points. We're not interested in perpetuating fear. We're interested in seeking truth, hearing what's really going on America's Borderland. Welcome to Borderland, an Ironclad original. My next guest is John Norris, who is a 25-year game warden who wrote a book called The Hidden War, as well as he was a guest on our show previously. He gives us some updates on what's going on in his neck of the woods and how he's supporting Native communities and also some of the toxins that are in our marijuana today. Check it out. Well, John, thank you again for gracing us with your presence on our show. Your last show was an eye-opener for a lot of people. I think no one really thought that there was a drug issue internally and that your organization, your agency was dealing with it. And so to bring that to light was fascinating, and I really appreciated that. For those who might have missed that and are probably the first time they're catching your episode, would you mind giving a quick rundown of your bio?
Yeah, no, Vince, great to be back on and see you for round two. It's been a dynamic couple months since we last talked with the election results, everything going down on the flooded border, which I'm sure we'll dive into. But for listeners and viewers, my name's John Norris, retired Fish and Wildlife Lieutenant out of the Golden State of California. Spent half of my career doing the traditional game warden stuff, then morphed into the special operations end once we started to find cartels from Mexico embedded in our forest, destroying the environment, armed with massive weaponry. And now we as game wardens are now up against the deadliest threat we've ever seen. So formed up the marijuana enforcement team, the first special operations unit dedicated to fighting that fight for our agency, sniper unit, advanced canines, you name it, because of the dangers involved. Been retired since the end of 2019. And with the launch of my second book, and Vince, that you've got a copy of, Hidden War, that really allowed me to talk about this issue more freely, not only the development of the team, but how it affects not just California, not just wildlife, but public safety everywhere throughout our great nation, including right down on that southern border where you at, brother, which is always a hotbed item. And we're dealing with that issue everywhere in the nation. And it's just good to be talking to you about that with so many dynamic changes today. And thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, that's what we're here to talk about, a lot of the changes. Since you were on the show last, was in May, have the cartel operations in the U.S. gotten worse since we last spoke?
They definitely have, largely because of the way the last administration's policy was on border protection. I know you and I talked about it a little bit the first time we had a great conversation, but those massive numbers of migrant crossings, with embedded deportable felons and cartel operatives from numerous organizations continue to flood the border since we talked. One of the things we started to see, besides Sinaloa, Jalisco New Generation, and the Mexican transnational criminal organizations, was this influx of Chinese operatives, and not your typical migrant. I mean, military-age males, thousands of them with clean passports coming directly from mainland China, and not here necessarily looking for that quote-unquote American dream and a fresh start from a really hard area where they came up from. These guys were coming across specifically to embed and do a number of crimes, which we started to see the last couple of years when I was leaving operational service, and really got to notice in retirement this Chinese influx into the cartel weed trade, working hand in hand with Sinaloa cartels and other cartels, and actually collaborating, having the Chinese crime groups and the Mexican cartels now actually partnered up, Vince, in America to do a ton of damage and make a ton of money with us as the middleman at our expense as Americans. That's been growing since we've talked. It's also been made a lot more public. Since we last talked, I was called to Congress a second time to testify and present on cartel impacts on tribal nations, which brought in this element of the Chinese being, complicit in that problem with Sinaloa and other cartels. We started to see the impacts on tribal nations even way back when I was doing early marijuana raids and just doing fish and game work in California because of those indigenous populations and those great tribes that had a ton of history and tradition in very pristine areas, perfect for growing, cartel weed, but they had so little enforcement. You guys were stretched thin on Border Patrol back in the day when you were there. And I know your
Yeah.
brother patrol borders and sisters and the ones I've had the privilege of working with, what's been going on the last 4 years. I can't tell you how depressed, I'm preaching to the choir when I talk about fellow agents that I worked with that are just so depressed not to have the impact they used to by policy. Well, now it's just flooded even more so with tribal lands being impacted simply because Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA officers are thinner than game wardens. They're thinner than Border Patrol. There's like two guys
Yep.
for a tribal nation that might be, a quarter of the size of the home state of Montana I'm in right now, brother. And so they're ripe for the pickings for a cartel faction that's pushing fentanyl, that's pushing, toxically tainted cannabis, the human trafficking element, women disappearing for sexual exploitation or human trafficking purposes. We started to see that over the last 10 years, and it's intensified these last 4 years, especially. As far north as right 2 hours, 3 hours somewhere I'm talking to you from now, in my home in Montana, where small tribal communities are being impacted and just decimated with fentanyl addiction, destroyed populations, assets being taken and taken back down to Mexico by these cartel groups that will come in and take over the fentanyl trade. And this got national news last year, and it really alarmed congressional committees, and hence my presence there to talk about those impacts from my perspective and experience. But people ask, Vince, what the heck would the cartels be doing as far away from Mexico and get as far north into America on the Canadian border to go to, some podunk little remote, low populated area of Montana? And the answer to that people just don't understand is we all know the fentanyl crisis is one of the biggest moneymakers, especially for the Mexican factions of those groups. A fentanyl pill in Chicago, I don't know what it goes for, out of one of these dirty labs in your home state of Texas, San Jose, Silicon Valley, where I'm originally from, $5, $10 a dirty pill. In these rural communities, it's $100 a pill because once the addiction starts, the demand is there. And basically, those cartel factions in Mexico realized, hey, we can go up with no enforcement presence, where we know these, BIA officers are so spread out, they can't possibly impact what we can do just by leveraging in on the drug trade. And that's what they've done in these tribal communities. And not only in the tribal communities, Vince, but small rural American traditional communities like Siskiyou County, Northern California, which we had a lot of experience in. You're seeing this stuff with the weed trade popping up in Maine, in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and just dominating that as well, with the human trafficking going on as well. And it's not getting better, but I think we're about to see the doors swing another direction, given the results of the election a week or so ago.
Yeah, I want to back you up a little bit. You said Chinese gangs have been working with our cartels here in America. What Chinese gangs or affiliates are you talking about that you've heard of? Because I haven't heard any, but that's something interesting I'd like to dig into.
Yeah, I haven't heard any names specifically. We just know the Chinese directly, whether it's the triads, whether it's, coming straight from governmental activities within China or individual guys in crime groups. I don't have names either, but they have definitely partnered up. And my friends in the DEA brought this to my attention about a year and a half ago when it was just starting. It hadn't made news yet. And what was happening is Chinese organizations embedded in America would basically want to get into the weed trade. They see lucrative profits in it. So we started to see the Chinese, the Hmongs, and the Asian crime groups in Northern California especially. And I want to go back to what we talked a little bit about in our first talk, because this is all going to make sense of why they're involved. We regulated weed recreationally and tightened up medicinal regulations back in 2016 with Proposition 64 in California. And like I like to say, California is the weed state of not only America but of the world, because we're one of 6 Mediterranean climates on the globe. And just like good wine in Napa Valley, and the Napa Valley wine California is known for, we have that Mediterranean climate. So outdoor, indoor growing, you name it, we grow really good weed in California. Cartels knew that, and they've been in there for years. Chinese and the Hmongs started to move out. Crime groups, I don't know the names necessarily, but we know they're vertically integrated. We know they're working very efficiently, coming out from Michigan, Wisconsin, from the East Coast. We hadn't seen necessarily this influx from mainland China through the border until recently, but they started popping up in indoor and remote private land grow sites as early as like 2017, 2018, right after we regulated. Well, everyone said, hey, you just regulated and now it's, a legal product. You're going to break the black market. Why is this still happening? And we did exactly what we should not have done when we regulated cannabis in California. And sadly, every other state that's regulating cannabis is following in the footsteps of what we did poorly in my old home state. And they're having the same cartel problems now. Is we made it a misdemeanor for outdoor or indoor illegal growing, down from a felony. And then we made it an infraction for juvenile offenders, which in these cartel grows, especially Sinaloa cartel grows, the hundreds that I worked, you would have minors in there, relatives of operatives that were adults, learning the ropes and in grow sites. And they were armed and they were as dangerous and doing as much damage as adults. And now all of a sudden we made the law like a seatbelt ticket,
Yeah.
a minor infraction. And so any criminal organization realized, hey, wait a minute, there is no penalty if we go and take our chances in California and grow this weed for the black market. And then we don't have to risk crossing the border. We can still produce down in Mexico, but we can produce here within the country and out of the West Coast, especially California. We're talking about, 80, 90% of the black market weed that's going all over the country is coming from these cartel factions. So we incentivized them with Prop 64. Other states did the same, unfortunately, and it's heartbreaking, man, and it's an uphill battle we've been fighting. But then you couple that with the open border, and then it just exacerbated 4 years ago. And obviously with COVID, with the pandemic and everybody on lockdown, I think you and I talked a little bit about the mindset of the cartels, and this is better than anybody. Culture of chaos, they thrive. When we have chaos in America, we shut down. We don't get to go patrol. We got to lock it up. We don't know, health and safety standards for a pandemic we don't understand. So they've been going nuts since that happened and before, and those two things have incentivized it. And the Chinese and the Hmongs learned this, and they said, hey, we can get into this in California because we have a lot of cash. We can buy into it. We can pay cash for properties. We can start to take over rural properties where there's 4 sheriff's deputies for 300 square miles. And they now have to deal with all these grows we're going to put up. And maybe they're going to take out 4 a week with search warrants when we've got 10,000, say, in the most pristine county left on the Oregon border called Siskiyou County. And they're absolutely decimating the county.
Yeah.
Decimating the county to such a point that you've got a couple thousand residences, veterans, cattlemen, ranchers, people that want a rural lifestyle. They've raised multiple generations of their family, and now they're leaving because it's not safe. They're being extorted for water. They're being told, if you make any problems for the activity I have here, you're not going to make it home. And so they're leaving. And so what's happening is we have these pristine American within our border counties being run by criminal organizations, either Chinese, Mexican cartels, or a combination of both. And how that can possibly be happening with all the resources we have blows my mind, like I know it blows yours. But that's one of the reasons we're talking about the hidden war. Is it's always been under the radar. This has been going on for the better part of 20 years. It's absolutely inflamed in the last 5 to 10. But it is definitely not on the number 1 or number 5 priority list of domestic problems we have. And I'm hoping that's going to change, and think it just might now. And I have some information on that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that for sure in a second. The tribal communities is really interesting to me. Why is it that the cartels is kind of targeting the tribal communities, and why is it? I mean, we already know the history of some of the tribal communities, and so why are they an easy target right now?
Yeah, the biggest reason is they're spread out and they just don't have a lot of resources to combat the problem. You also see a lot of alcohol, a lot of drug addiction in some of these tribal communities for multiple reasons. So they kind of are a easy victim and prey for these cartel groups, regardless of where they're coming from. And it's not just the weed, primarily it's the fentanyl and human trafficking that we're seeing in Northern California, in Montana, in this highlight that I've talked about on other shows, especially us based in Montana, and that really got Congress's attention. And at the end of the day, until we can get them more resources, because tribal police, unless there is an MOU with a state or federal law enforcement agency, we don't work together. And interesting story, back when we started the marijuana enforcement team, and in 2013, when we had our pilot program, we had a month-long operation called Operation Pristine, and we worked 30 days straight to prove the worth of the team so we could go full-time and justify it to our administration the following year. And we were working with the 129th. We were working with some SF guys out of Moffett Field. We had the counter drug task force and the PAPOC helicopter teams that were not deployed so they could work counter drug. And we actually got an invite from the Hoopa Reservation, a tribe up in Northern California in Humboldt County on that beautiful Trinity River. And the craziest part about that is that we had never really had a good working relationship just between tribal nations doing their own thing and us on, domestic properties, whether it be public land or private land. But we worked together, and it was really a magical experience because they reached out to us, one, because we had a fish and wildlife element, and we had an environmental concern over water quality, diversion of water, poison water, decimation of forests, wildlife, et cetera. And they were having so many cartel grows impact their tribal lands that weren't getting handled, that we were in a huge drought at that time in California, and they were literally within days of turning on their drinking water and the water they would use to cook and shower with and not having it. Some facilities actually ran out of water because so much water was being sucked from the rivers, from the creeks, and all of that, like we talked about in the last discussion, all that marijuana that the cartels grow in that forest have these EPA banned toxins called carbofuran and metaphos and substances like that they're felonies to possess and use in America on agriculture because they're so toxic. They're nerve agents. And they just destroy tons of water, tons of wildlife. They're deadly to humans. So the Hoopa reached out for help. The Yurok did the same thing with us, and we had the opportunity in our infancy to rebuild bridges between domestic law enforcement / military and tribal police. And those guys and gals were amazing to work with. Once we got shoulder to shoulder and started, eradicating grows or cleaning up grows, a lot of it, yeah, we were doing some raids, but most of it was these traditional grow sites, Vince, that had been out there like a decade. They have no resources to clean them up. So even though the grow is harvested, say 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and that, multi-million product made it to the black market, had all the poisons on it, a bunch of unknowing consumers throughout the US in the Eastern Seaboard and Midwest where the stuff is sold, smoked or ingested that stuff, not knowing it was poison. Now they got all the poisons in the water. They got all this camp trash, fertilizers, all this destroyed environment, water diversions, and they weren't getting touched. So those environmental impacts from a game warden like me, that's really alarming. And to hunters, anglers, anybody that, recreates in the outdoors and wants to just see that and enjoy that, that stuff was exponentially continuing to be destroyed, even though there wasn't a grow there. And that's where we came into the picture. And we weren't even aware because there wasn't a lot of data sharing going on between tribal nations and, say, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife or U.S. Forest Service or Border Patrol, Department of Interior, whatever. And now we're starting to share and realize, hey, we got to work together somehow, some way. And now we're starting to do interagency MOUs at the federal and state level with tribal nations, with their elders, and going out and being a force multiplier and really making a dent. And then to see this come full circle, brother, before this congressional thing got brought up last year, 10 years ago, and now I'm seeing what's happening in Montana, my new home state, and it's just breaking my heart. And they're even more impacted, I think, than California was because Montana is so big, just like Texas. We're massive up here. And we have these little tiny towns that have 500, 600, 2,000 people. And that's basically a tribal nation for hundreds of thousands of remote wilderness acres. And they need help. And that's something we want to implement up here. And tribal nations all over the country are on that target list, like you brought up. And this is why it's happening. And this is something we can work with if we can get past the red tape to work with these nations. And that's starting to happen. It really is, slowly but surely, it's starting to happen. And it's really cool to see.
Yeah, the Border Patrol for as long as I can remember has always had good relationships with some of the tribal lands. But it's also the tribal lands is a way of kind of avoiding the federal agencies to come on into the
Yep.
lands and defend it. And so there's
Yep.
times when we
Yep.
know there's positive traffic happening, but we can't get the approvals to get on the land. And so there's always some kind of challenges. And when I was younger, I actually worked for a fire department in a native area, and it was just different traffic how they worked. Like the
Right.
community of itself has its own culture, and so having to learn that culture before working it. So really cool to hear. The community, the native community, I think it's one that it's near and dear to my heart. That they've kind of been pushed to the wayside for so long, and I'm happy to see that there's building them up again and helping with some of these issues. It's kind of wild. You mentioned the toxic that's tainted in some of the cannabis is a public safety issue. Can you talk more on that?
Yeah, and I'm glad we're hitting that because we really need to highlight that. This is something that, like the copy of the book I sent you, the second edition. There's a lot of color pictures in that thing for a reason. My publisher was really good to like paint a picture with, tell a story with a lot of really colorful pictures. Like carbofuran, metaphos, they're basically insecticide, rodenticides, kind of a kill anything aside, I call it, that were developed. Some of the ingredients, honestly, were developed during the Nazi regime in World War II for their chemical weapon program. So they're basically nerve agents that do central nervous system destruction. They thin out your blood. They're anticoagulants. So they're basically made to, if you ingest any of this poison, all that happens in your body. They were made originally like a 16 to 12 or 12 to 16 ounce container of like a powder of, say, metaphos or carbofuran was made to be diluted with about 6,000 gallons of water and then sprayed on agricultural crops to keep everything off the crop until it made it to market. Well, it was found by EPA when they got their technology situated, about 20 years ago. They started to do studies and go, whoa, wait a minute. This stuff, even diluted to that level, is way too toxic for us to consume, whether it's washed off or on what we're eating in our fruit and our vegetables. So they said, nope, this stuff can't be used. It's manufactured. It just can't be used in America. But it is manufactured throughout, other parts of the world and third world countries especially, and it's still being allowed to be used or you can get it. So what this stuff does so well on marijuana, especially for primarily the Mexican cartels, and we're going to talk about the Chinese poisons that just dropped that I was made aware of very recently within the last year that are as, if not more deadly, and that element. But basically, now they have to smuggle these up from Tijuana because they can't get them here. So any grow operations going on for Mexican operatives in America, not just California, but any of the other states where it's going on, they smuggle them up with their growers, their tier one growers from Tijuana. They have this stuff. They know it's poisonous. Even though they're growers, their operatives are being exposed to this stuff. They're still told they have to use it. And they don't dilute it enough. I've literally seen half of one of these 12-ounce containers poured into a 5-gallon backpack irrigation sprayer like we'd use on our garden. And they're spraying this stuff, man. And there's pictures in the book that show a cartel grower all camoed out with a backpack sprayer spraying this on 11-foot marijuana plants behind Mount Hamilton, behind the Silicon Valley where I grew up, where I actually harvested my first deer as a young deer hunter at 14 years old under tutelage of dad on the same ranch that I was hunting then as a sportsman's club. They're growing this massive, massive cartel grow, bro. And here's pictures from his cell phone camera that we seized, spraying the heck out of this stuff. And then he's got a golden eagle, which is a very endangered and protected massive raptor like a bald eagle in California. He's holding it up and taking a picture of it to show his bosses. I got that right away when it came in. That sucker died. So again, wildlife cops sees that and we're like, oh, hell no, that's not cool. And it was actually a year later in another grow where I got in a foot pursuit with that dude because we ambushed a grow and caught him. And I chased him down with a backpack sprayer on his back. We got into a hand-to-hand roll down a mountain before I got him into custody. And brother, no exaggeration, I did not know at that time, that was early 2000s or mid 2000s. We knew about these insecticides, but we did not know yet about how deadly carbofuran was. And he had a backpack sprayer during the tussle. And fortunately, it didn't open up, or I might not be sitting here, man, because it was crazy. But then I started to see how bad this stuff is, to water. You think, well, okay, that's what it does to an animal like that. And just like in the book, I've got pictures of 400-pound black bears. They go into a grow site like below Yosemite National Park. And what the growers would do is those cartel guys would take tuna cans they'd be empty, but they'd have a little tuna oil in them, and they'd put a couple drops of carbofuran and a little bit of food, and they just put them out as like little landmines, perimeter traps, so that any animal that goes in toward the grow that might want to eat the plant, they lick up a microscopic amount of that stuff, maybe just less than a teaspoon. And this 400-pound black bear is just frothing up and dying 15 minutes later. You got the baby bear, her cub that is exposed now too, and up a tree above mom freaking out. And the reason I put those graphic pictures in the book, and mountain lions and you know the sheep and things like the eagles I just mentioned, is it's a real unifying message when you get to liberal, conservative, growers, non-growers, hunters, animal conservationists versus preservationists. Everybody sees those pictures, or they hear that story when I tell it, and they go, hey, I don't agree with hunting, but man, I'll tell you what I really don't agree with. That is no way for an animal to die. And if that's what's happening in our forest, what is that stuff doing to us? And Vince, we got to remember, a couple tablespoons of carbofuran in a small creek can literally destroy all the aquatics in that creek for miles. And that is not an exaggeration. And this stuff is all over our forests. It's brought up, you know, like I said, from Tijuana, smuggled with operatives, because everything else they can get here. Their middlemen are here with infrastructure, with piping, with food, with weapons. They're good to go. They just can't get that poison. And I'm glad you brought it up, because it's out there. And to take it a step further, lo and behold, I start getting some pictures and some really interesting data from my friends in DEA just about a year ago about these Chinese poisons that we started to see in Northern California in Chinese Asian grow houses. All Chinese writing on them. They come straight from mainland China, and they are classified in that same class. They're anticoagulant, nerve agents. They're antifungals. They're nasty. And
What's
then
the
when we
point of
started
those
to go,
sprays? Those sprays are just to protect the plant from bugs and stuff.
yeah, well, they want to
Have they
keep
been
them
able to-
bugs. Yeah.
Yeah. Have they been able to prove that that transfers over to the human consumption during as they smoke it or whatnot?
Absolutely. What happens is it's put on the plant and it's put on the bud. And there's pictures in Hidden War. I got a picture of a marijuana plant that's not quite to harvest. It's got bud on it and leaves and flower. And then it's got it almost looks like white spray paint or bird droppings, you know, and it's drying as a white substance. But that was when it was applied within probably a day when we found that. We later learned through our protocol of dealing with these grow sites, if we see plants that are that wet, even with our N95 masks, nitrile gloves, all of our, full personal protection equipment, it's still too hot and too deadly and too hazardous to deal with that grow. But what happens, Vince, in 48 hours, all that toxic stuff that looks white or opaque, wet on the plant, it grows completely invisible. It dries. So once it's dry, it's on it. This stuff gets processed in the grow. It gets dried. It gets packaged, and it goes back for anybody on the black market to consume. Now, because it dissipates, it doesn't kill instantly. We know that. But people that have respiratory issues or any kind of odd things that are developing, if they're a cannabis consumer, might want to look very carefully at this. I know of at least 3 or 4 of our officers that were exposed to carbofuran on a grow entry, either just through the air, whether it was an aerosol or on a plant itself. We didn't have anybody die, thank heaven, but we had guys with respiratory issues, lose sight for a while, some nervous stuff. And fortunately, they're okay. And then when I retired and the book dropped and I could talk about this stuff freely like we're doing today, bro, I've been getting emails and personal messages for years from federal officers, state officers all over our country going, oh yeah, man, I went into a grow house. I got treated. I know I hit some of that stuff. My nervous system hasn't been right. I'm on medical retirement. I'm done. And I'm not getting any better. And I'm not talking about it. I can't talk about it, blah, blah, blah. So this stuff is out there, man. And we just got to be careful. And now that the Chinese have their own crap, that's as deadly, if not more so. And they're doing a lot more with the weed trade right now, honestly, than the Mexican cartels are, for a lot of reasons. We got to be careful.
We don't just do the filmmaking. We do everything. We've taken a case study of over 30 projects that we've done over the past 15 years, and we put together what we believe is the most effective and efficient content funnel for brands. They need content on a daily basis. They need to be talking to authentic end users. We want your team to bring its most challenging problems and allow us and our team to apply our proven methods to your brand to take it to another level.
Did You mentioned, are there any new developments in the production and distribution of fentanyl and methamphetamine in the U.S.? Anything that you've heard of recently?
The main thing I've heard about is how much more they're hitting the tribal nations and dominating those tribal nations where they can make a lot more money. One thing also I've learned from the fentanyl standpoint is the number of deaths. There's been this figure walking around of how many Americans are truly dying from this stuff. And the last word I got from my sources in the DEA that are connected to this and keeping up on it, within the last couple of months, 74,000 Americans right now are dying from these dirty fentanyl pills coming out of labs. And I'm thinking, wow, let's put that in perspective. 74,000 Americans is 200 people a day, give or take, if I do the math. And so I'm like, while we're sitting here having this conversation, how many Americans are going to die from that, whether they're kids, whether they're, adults. And what I can say that I've learned personally is I don't know anybody now that isn't, if they're not directly affected by a fentanyl death or a fentanyl overdose from these pills, they're indirectly affected. I have friends and relatives where I grew up in the Silicon Valley and spent most of my life and my career. And it just breaks my heart. We've had literally kids that, like family members, your awesome daughter going to law school, motivated, doing her thing. That's freaking awesome. And I have a lot of friends and family doing that with their kids and grandkids. And you get a valedictorian from a really good school in Silicon Valley, and she has an injury from a volleyball game or something and knee pain, takes a fentanyl pill that she gets thinking it's a pain pill from a friend, and goes in to do her homework, and she's a senior, and this is actually how the story goes. This was a year ago, or approximately a year and a half, and goes in to do her advanced placement homework. She's got a ton of stuff on her plate. She's already set to go to a great school, and mom goes to wake her up the next morning to get ready to go to school, and she's never waken up again. Yeah. And I mean, if that doesn't hit America on every level, plus the less fortunate groups and everything else with resources, that's something that's getting kind of crazy. One other trend I can talk about, and this is just disgusting and disturbing. I was kind of wondering when we started to see this influx of all these Chinese and Hmong growers in California, and knowing that that area was dominated by Sinaloa the whole time I was working operations, right? I'm like, how are they getting along, right? Why aren't we seeing more fighting from that? Is it territorial? Did Sinaloa and did the Mexican groups just give up because they're still involved in weed? It's not as lucrative as fentanyl, but it's still lucrative. They're not going to give up some money they can make on this. And then I come to find out a year and a half or so, about a year ago, and even more so on the logistics of it, these Chinese groups and these Mexican groups now have basically collaborated to the point to where they're trading services for services. Now, the Mexican groups are still involved in clandestine weed, but they're backing out of it and giving it to the Chinese because the Chinese like doing it. They can make cash money. They want a ton of money they can launder clean and in place right here in America. It doesn't have to go overseas. In exchange for, Vince, all the precursor chemicals, Sinaloa, Jalisco New, and any of the other cartels involved in fentanyl, they're getting their precursors directly from these Chinese groups. And then the best part, and I learned this recently, Sinaloa, whatever other cartel typically has to take 6% of all of the hundreds of millions or billions of cash dollars they make in numerous cartel crimes, whether it be weed, fentanyl, human child sex, gun running, whatever they're into, and there's a bunch of other stuff they've added. So about 6%, to try to launder that money and not have it tracked. Well, the Chinese said, hey, we'll launder for less, and you cut us a break and get us those precursors we need, right? And they started to exchange, and it was 5% if you launder through the Chinese groups, and then it was 4%. And as of maybe 3-4 months ago, I'm told it's 0%. Mexicans, cartels are laundering their money for no fee through the Chinese. However they're doing that, it's embedded all over America. Those precursor chemicals go right to who. The weed stays with the Chinese. They're getting along great. They're making a ton of money. A lot of us are losing our health and our kids, and it's happening right here all over the country. And we're just like watching this happen. And guys like you and me and your old agency and mine, we're fighting the fight as best we can within policy, right? Within resources allowed. And we know what we're doing. We're playing whack-a-mole at best. So this knowledge I dumped on Congress in my first testimony. I brought it up again, especially when I had the opportunity to run tribal land stuff. And now you've got some action up there, man. You've got bipartisan Senate and Congress groups looking at investigating this and taxing DOJ with how many of these cannabis operations that are going down federally have the Asian Chinese element in them. And we want to know the data. We want to see the actual reports. It's all been kind of under wraps. So this is a step, dude, in the positive direction, especially for all the work you've done out there on your side and what we've done here. It's a little scary when you look at that type of collaboration and the type of reach they can have because how much presence they have here and how many resources they have here throughout America.
Yeah. several things on that. It's just look at how fast the trend, the TDA, Tren de Agua, has spread throughout America, and that's just
crazy. Mm-hmm.
Just from that example alone, it's how well the Chinese have also been spread. Those who are here to try and inflict damage or nefarious reasons. I think CBP said somewhere around 35,000 have come over, have come over through the border illegally that have been processed. Another number I had was somewhere close to 75,000 in the last 4 years. And so
that's crazy,
of
man.
Chinese nationals. Any one of those numbers, 75,000 is just insane, but even 35,000, if that is a true and factual number, that is pretty devastating to hear, especially if a bigger percentage of that is here for nefarious reasons, such as the grows, drugs, whatever the case it might be.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wild. What are some of your thoughts on the upcoming administration? The political policies that hopefully, what they say they'll plan to do. What are some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was definitely going to try to bring it up as well. And let's talk about the new administration, where things were going before the last administration, what happened the last 4 years, and where the Trump group is. One thing is, I know we talked about. I was recently on Julian Dory's podcast in New Jersey, and I know you had just been on it. I didn't know that until I got to see him.
Well, do you know what happened with my episode?
What's that? Yeah,
you know what happened
I heard you freaking banned it every time you said human trafficking.
Yep.
Crazy.
That episode has not even been able to be seen because they kept shutting it down.
Oh, brother, he's pushing it. In fact, when I was in his studio with Alisi, with his producer, and we were talking to you, I'm like, yeah, I know Vince and blah, blah, blah. And we were having how good this conversation went with you. And he said, yeah, do you know what happened to his episode? And he literally showed me the ban on the production grids. I'm like, what for sin? But he's working some stuff to get that back in.
Yeah.
And he's pushing hard, man. The kid's wired right. And I
had
he's
great. He's great. It's just funny how I'm the least controversial in how I speak on the subject intentionally.
Yeah, you said it generically. There wasn't anything. Yeah, just crazy. But I'm looking forward to seeing that when I finally can. I haven't seen the episode yet, and mine's not dropped until I think December. But I brought up dealing with like what the Trumps have said. They kind of said, hey, we're going to declare war potentially on the cartels. I mean, they kind of said that in not so many words. And ever since that got brought up, it's been talked about on a lot of other podcasts and et cetera, et cetera. And I actually had Julian and Alisi I said, pull up the definition of terrorism on your screen right there.
Yeah.
Let's really look at the definition, using violence, right, to coerce for political gain, non-combatants for either political or, ideological gain. Well, when I look at what the Chinese and the Mexican groups have done, say in Northern California, where they've literally changed the direction of a community. They've gotten involved in voting in elections. Residents have left. They've changed the demographic. And then let's not forget that economic, goals kind of go hand in hand sometimes with political goals, however you read between the lines. And I've always said, I consider this an ecological terrorism war when you talk about the wildlife issues, but I think we have a domestic terrorism event going on with the damage they're inflicting on Americans, either indirectly or directly. Now, does that mean we just unleash the military? Not necessarily, but we have to do something. And I know, brother, you and I talked a little bit about this the first time, something that's a little more targeted and a little more hands-off and a little more people involved on the enforcement side. And not just enforcement. We don't just do this by waving a stick. You and I both know we got to educate. We got to bring our kids into this. We got to educate them on human trafficking, target indicators, fentanyl, what these pills can do, what this weed does. Like when I show high school assemblies, all these gory pictures of the weed and farms and the cartel stuff, and kids go, whoa, I use weed, Lieutenant, but I don't know if I don't get something from someone, I may not even smoke another joint. I'm like, I'm not saying big brother. That's not my job, guys, kids. I just want you to know what's out there.
Yeah.
And you don't, I don't want to see you hurt, but more importantly, don't be complicit to this criminal group doing this in America. But that's a really, really interesting thing when you look at how we define this cartel threat, and can we make what I call the hidden war a little less hidden and make it a domestic priority? I think you and I dabbled a little bit in our first conversation. Put this in the top three, man. You know, proxy wars like the stuff going on in Ukraine and all this other stuff we're doing and putting billions of dollars. We could take, give me a quarter of that money. You know, just give me 25% of those multi-billions that have gone over to Ukraine for this proxy war and put it into enforcement, multi-agency activities, federal, state, local, maybe military where it's appropriate, whether it's like counter drug that's here for the right domestic reasons, helping us out, education, rehabilitation, all of those things. And I think we'd really make a dent. And I think we're on that path that if it's ever going to happen, I think it might happen now. And I do have to tell a quick story. In 2016, when it comes to the Trumps, I was at SHOT Show, you know, our tactical trade show that you and I are very familiar with, and most of our listeners and viewers are. And I was there doing this
many years.
Yeah. Well, it was 2016. Our team was 2 years old. And what was I doing there? I was doing outreach, but I was looking for equipment, you know, and getting my team sorted out on the Met front. And I was invited with some special ops guys by the owner of an outdoor apparel company, KUIU, Jason Hairston, who's very tight with Don Jr. because Don Jr. is a big hunter. They mountain hunt together. I'm a KUIU guy. We were using their stuff. We were developing tactical lines of stuff with that organization, along with the SEAL teams. And there are about 60 of us in the outdoor tactical industry or in operations domestic or law enforcement military that were invited to meet with the Trumps in SHOT Show, 60 of us, one evening. And it was right when Don Sr. was about to hit the campaign trail, head to the caucuses, late January. And my first book, War in the Woods, Jason had a copy of, and it blew him away when we started working with KUIU. But he said, get a copy of the book. I want to bring you this thing. I want you to introduce you to the Trumps. You got to tell them this story. I said, well, how do they not know this story? I mean, you hunt with Don Jr. He goes, they don't know this story. They need to know it. And when I met Don Jr. and Sr. with the book, and Jason introduced us, and I told him who I was, and we had a little function. There were a bunch of other things going on. And I remember Don Jr. looking at Jason, looking at me, and he just looks up and he goes, John's a game warden enforcing wildlife crimes in California and the Silicon Valley, and they're dealing with Mexican cartels and poisons and AK-47 gunfights. And he just said, how the F do me and my dad not know this? And he said, that's exactly why we're having this conversation, Don. And I got 5-10 minutes with the man. We did our photos. And I said, okay, let's see what happens. One, he wasn't going to win the election. So, but he won the election, you know? And I remember we were doing night sniper training by design the night of the election because I didn't want to be around for a bad result. And so all of our guys went out and did a night op for quals. And I got back at 11 that night. My family's like, guess what? Guess who's winning the election? Couldn't believe it. Within a month of that, brother, I kid you not, remember Jeff Sessions was the AG, the first AG in the Trump administration right when he got elected. And all of a sudden, we go on complete lockdown in California, sanctuary state, don't talk to ICE or work with Border Patrol. What? We can't talk to these guys? We're federally deputized. They're federal agents by policy. We're going to share with our Border Patrol and our ICE brothers, and you're telling us not to. So we're getting this complete denial of shutting down any type of interaction or even talking about cartels in California. But now all of a sudden, Forest Service that was in the previous beatdown, now they're funded with multi-million dollars, Operation Forest Watch, right from Trump and Sessions. And no longer will a marijuana case, U.S. attorneys look at it and go, it's only weed in the forest. I don't care. I'm going for white dope. All of a sudden, they looked at environmental crime. They put a ton of money into it. And now we were working with the feds and literally kicking ass and taking names and shutting down grows, reclamating them. So that was a breath of fresh air. I know how that administration is wired. That alone, you get my vote for that. I don't like to get very political, Vince. I try to stay out of it. I didn't endorse a candidate. I love the way you do it, brother. I let you put the information out there, be reasonable. You know, we can all lean different ways depending on the issue. And I think we need to look at issues individually. I tend to stay more middle of the road. But in this case, I don't think there's anything more urgent with all the other things that have come out in this election result than what we're talking about today. And again, thank you for getting into these issues, because people can learn a lot from this, and not necessarily for political reasons, but maybe to help identify that, yeah, I want this to be more of a priority than some of the other things I think our national money's going to.
Yeah, there's just proven, I guess, track record of what the Trump administration has done and what they plan to do. I'm very curious about their approach and their tact with this subject and how
Yes.
they're going to
Yeah.
handle it. I would love for them to do it in a way that doesn't ruffle too many feathers, but in this conversation, it ruffles feathers no matter what, because it's such a divisive topic, because
It
of the
is.
lack of understanding of the topic, right? And so the lack of education of the topic. For some, you know how it is. For some reason, when you tell people like we want to, deport illegal immigrants, like all of a sudden their views on that turn into deporting immigrants, and like, no,
Right.
I don't think you heard us, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm curious to see how it all goes. I really want to, I'm more in a position of kind of standing in the crowd, watching and hoping it's for the best of the American people. But the conversation with the cartel is a very fascinating one, knowing our backgrounds and
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
what do we plan on doing as a country? Are we really going to designate them as terrorists? And if we are, then does that open up the U.S. military to engage? And will we be doing that in a way where we partner up with Mexican officials, which becomes very scary, because who is corrupted and who is not in that
Yes.
world? So the
Absolutely.
whole thing, I think, it is very layered, more so, I believe, than the Al Qaeda or going after ISIS back in the day with military. This is almost like getting into an argument with your neighbor and hoping it works out.
I like that analogy, man. That's spot on. It's too close. It's too much of a neighbor. And you said it really well when you said automatically that hot button, you get under the skin of, oh, now you're going to deport, immigrants. And what about non-cartel? And again, I always come back to what we are not trying to do is stop legitimate immigration. In fact, if
Yeah,
anything, one thing I do like that the administration said, they want to streamline the process and give everybody that wants to chase this American dream that should be here, hey man, flood it.
yeah,
Just bring good, safe people in. I mean, you and we're part of a melting pot, and I think we're so blessed to be that. I'm not
yes,
originally from here either, man. I'm European and all over the place, um, but yeah, that's a very, very, very provocative question, and has to be handled very delicately.
yeah,
Because I think defined or not as a terrorist, going into Mexico and sending special operations guys in there, yeah, that could be it could be another bad episode of Sicario, right? Sicario 5 or
yeah.
whatever. It could be really, really bad if it's not structured properly. But let me ask you something, brother, from the Border Patrol standpoint, and I've already heard from my Border Patrol friends that are just letting out a big sigh of relief that, hey, we're going to go back to protecting this border, saving more lives. We're not going to be processing people, not worrying about, these hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minors, the bodies we're pulling out. And you were just down there, I saw, patrolling with the guys with Texas. What's your vibe down there with your old homies and from Border Protection? And what do you like to see out of this? And what do you think will happen if you got any idea?
Yeah, I think we're going to have a very similar 4 years of what the original Trump administration had. I think it's going to be very similar to that. In that sense, I think the Border Patrol agents' morale was high, in the sense of they felt like they were doing a job that brought them satisfaction. Like they were doing the work that they're supposed to. The hard part is that the media, in those 4 years of the Trump administration, the media attacked the Border Patrol, and they turned the Border Patrol into the enemy. And
Yeah.
they told people that they were the same as the Nazis, and they were holding concentration camps and all these concepts. And so my biggest thing is knowing that I think we should be very. I think the media really has to have a reset on how they approach these conversations, because they demonize and scrutinize the Border Patrol career field without educating the people on what the job actually is. And
Yeah.
so, in that sense, those 4 years of the Trump administration might have been good for the agents' morale, in the sense where they feel like they're doing the work that they're supposed to, or that they were trained to. But the media got a hold of them as well, and that hurt a lot of the agency
It really
as
did,
well as
yeah.
recruitment. You start having people doubt maybe the career is justified or justifiable, and you have people really questioning, the morality of their career. And I don't think there ever should be a question of what they do. I've done it, and it is really, you're spending more time saving lives and safeguarding human life than you are ever in any kind of physical confrontation. And just by the way of numbers and by way of per capita, that agency has more agents being attacked and hurt on a daily basis than any other law enforcement across the nation, and vice versa, has the least amount of engagements of any other law enforcement in the nation. And so, when people get the discrepancy of the career field, well, that makes it hard as a career. As these agents kind of turn on the news and hear something bad about themselves. So I really hope that what we're doing here on this show, what my book would be doing, and other people out there who are telling the career field of the Border Patrol, I hope it gives the Border Patrol, the feeling that they have allies now, and and they have a voice again.
Yeah, it seems to be going that direction, and you hit it on the head. I getting to work with you guys and knowing the challenges, I liken it to being, you got to be the jack of all trades, and you got to be that community-oriented policeman in the Wild West. You got to work with people. You're saving, you're nurturing more than, like you said, than ever having those engagements. Very similar to what we use in the game warden world do, especially with what it's morphed into. And I hope to see the turn, because I have a lot of friends in your agency, you included, and the morale stories I was getting even from the guys up here on the Alberta border that I see
Yes.
every day when I'm in that were sent down there and doing deployments. And now they're back up here going, oh man, we got to talk. I got to just vent. And I'm like, what? When, you guys were whipping, migrants crossing with whips on your horses. It's like, no, you guys got, that whole thing. And right away I saw how that was being played in the media and how so destructive that could be to, the woman that just doesn't understand. And I do like the fact that there's already been a big emphasis on getting more of you guys down there.
Yeah.
And that is so critical.
Well, the hard
represented
part
you
about
guys
that
are.
is we need to find people who want to apply for the job. For so many years, they've demonized the career field, so that how many Americans actually feel proud to do the service, right? And so we're hoping that, with efforts that the Border Patrol has put into place, that there's a bigger recruitment for the military.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. I got a very provocative one. I mean, I've had so many interviews in the past 2 months that this continues to pop up, and I'd love to hear your opinion on it.
Oh gosh.
Several,
All right. Send it.
several. I mean, I'll just give you the list. An investigative journalist out of Mexico, a economist, also a former drug trafficker himself.
Yeah.
Multiple people have stated that they believe the only way to win this war on drugs is to legalize drugs.
Well, what I can say is I'll talk about cannabis first.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't matter where I sit on the cannabis continuum personally. I'm not a cannabis user. National regulation for that product that 45 plus million Americans are going to consume, and they're not going to stop consuming it, whether it's regulated, unregulated, in dispensaries, whatever. We know for PTSD, veterans, et cetera, we know there's medicinal benefits to cannabis, and they haven't even been really federally documented because the scheduling hasn't changed. And I do know that if we've always said that if you look at cannabis regulation like Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, like wine, alcohol, and tobacco, and regulate it that way with a uniform standard of quality, of purity, of distribution, of legality, et cetera, you would take most of that cartel money and that activity, I think, out of that faction for our cartel. I don't think we'd be dealing with the weed cartel so much. You'd see it more into the fentanyl and trafficking. On the other drugs, I honestly don't know. I know when it comes to especially the opiates, and you look at this fentanyl thing, and you look at crack, and you look at all these different derivative, let's take methamphetamine, man, the super meth, the P2P stuff that's made in these 22-pound dirty labs. That stuff is, I mean, it's crazy,
Yeah.
And so Oregon tried the whole regulation thing with letting the white dope go for a while, and that has become an absolute mess in that because they didn't have the infrastructure to deal with the backlash on that, with whether it was addiction or the crime that followed. I don't know that I can say it's good or bad. I think if we ever actually look at national legalization of any of those drugs, beyond the cannabis continuum right now, all that has to be looked at, and there has to be a plan in place by how is it going to be monitored, how is it going to be regulated and structured on some level. And no state that's even tried to dabble in it, like Oregon, have even come close to making it happen. So it's not a great answer. I can't say yes or no
That's
because I
good.
just don't know enough of the rest of it. Where do you sit on it, or from your standpoint, with what you've heard from all of us so far?
Yeah, it's funny, anything that kind of disrupts the cartel's funding is fascinating to me. I'm like, ooh, that sounds like I'd like to try that.
Potential. Yeah,
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 yeah. So
yeah.
it got my attention, right? And then
Right.
also by the fact of, if we can regulate it, we can control it, we can manage it, then we can also tax it, which means then money goes back into our pockets to our American people. If we can implement some kind of, because once you start doing that, I think it takes away from the idea of like, ooh, this is bad for some people, and it starts to become almost a social norm. And in that sense, not everyone uses drugs, not
Yeah.
everyone becomes an addict, and so in that sense, maybe you remove the power from the cartel and you put it back in our hands. We have to understand, and we have to get down to the bottom of why America is the biggest consumer of the product already in the first place. So once we have to fundamentally figure that out as a country, but as now we have the power to do so with the money to hopefully create other kind of maybe addiction clinics or whatnot, or inpatient therapy. But it's fascinating. The other side of it is, well, the cartels already knows that there's more money in a commodity called human beings, right?
Oh
And
man,
and you're
exactly.
not,
Yes.
and
Yep.
so then if you destroy one thing, dismantle the whole drug, highway, then they're just going to probably double up on human commodity, right? And that becomes a scary thing because we also are the highest consumer of human trafficking, and which becomes even more bonkers.
And it's so crazy that of the leading problems we have with the biggest enemies we face, we're talking about all these crimes the cartels do. They don't do it because we don't facilitate it. We have the biggest demand, like you said, whether it's weed, whether it's fentanyl, whether it's human trafficking, child sex, whatever. And you bring up a very, very good point. Could that take it out of the cartel's hands? And why do we have these addictions anyway? And again, I look at, the big pharma debacle with oxycodone and
Yes.
everything else, and it's not addictive. And now you're starting to see all these documentaries and feature films made about how that went down, and you're like,
Yeah.
okay, well then basically our own corporate pharmaceutical structure has been somewhat, if not very much complicit in this
Absolutely.
acceptance of a norm, right, brother? So
Right.
you hit it on the head that, and if you're going to take that away, we've already incited this problem. So who do we put it back on to facilitate these legal drugs? And is it going to be structured carefully where we don't have another, big pharma profit driven versus addictive and treatment? And now you're decimating communities, because it did become a norm. It has become a lifestyle, especially with the kids, right? That
Yes.
pain pill that comes from big pharma, whatever it may be. And hey, it's got to be good, man. My dad
Well,
takes because he was injured. It's a
yeah.
painkiller
Well,
prescribed by a tier
the
one
other
surgeon.
problem, what we always fail to acknowledge is how alcohol has been legal, and it's one of the
Yes.
biggest killers of our
Yep.
culture, of our time, of even
Yep.
beforehand. And
Good point.
that's legal, and that's barely regulated, and it's culturally okay in the Latino community to drink at a young age.
Yes. Yeah.
We've indoctrinated that into our culture as if, oh wait, yeah, but that's just drinking, no big deal.
Yeah.
This is weed or this is cocaine. It's like, wait a minute.
Whoa, time
You
out,
could be,
man.
yeah. You don't necessarily die from an opiate overdose because of the opiate is toxic. You die because of respiratory distress. And so
Right.
it's like, but no, alcohol is toxic, and every time you drink it, you're partly killing yourself, right? There's a toxin in that. So
Yeah.
it's a very
100%.
strange way that we look at all of this.
Yeah, I think diving into, where the real corporate is and what is really going to be the solution that's reasonable. Like we can throw a ton of resources out of it. We can have the right mindset from the administration. I definitely know the American people spoke in this election, and I know that
Yes.
the mindset of generally all so much more of a dominating percentage, right? A massive percentage made a choice here. And I just hope we look at everything comprehensively. And it's alcohol abuse, it's this thing on cannabis. And are we going to reschedule cannabis? Are we going to study it more? Are we going to try to nip that one in the bud and, not forget about alcohol, because we always do. You said it really well. We just forget about alcohol. It's so widely accepted, but we're having more deaths, more violence, more problems from that than cannabis overdoses or violent encounters or, drunk driving or whatever we truly are from the alcohol standpoint.
And suicide. Yep.
Yeah, it is. But right before the election, and I don't know if you heard this figure when we were talking about the border, control the border. We got to stop the flood. We know how much bad stuff is getting in. It's in, right? And now it's a domestic problem. And they're saying even if we got on this thing tomorrow, which Trump has said we're going to do, and we do this for the next decade, it's going to take like a decade to sort out who's here properly, who's involved in criminal organizations, what the spinoff is. I mean, that is a daunting task, man, for any administration. And that's not going to cost a couple of dollars, but all those different issues of why they're here and why we're facilitating some of these markets and why we are the ground for their money has to be addressed. And it has to be addressed. And you brought up some really, really good points on national regulation, or let's say legalization of all drugs. And it'll be really interesting, brother, to see what happens the next 2, 3, 4 years when
absolutely
kind of the cooling off period of the transition has happened, and we're well underway in 3, 4, 5 months. I'm hoping for the best, man.
What I like is that I think what the nation has shown is that they do have the power to vote.
Yes.
And in 4 years or in 3.5 years, if we're not happy, we'll do it again.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's, to me, is what's exciting. Is like,
yeah,
in 3.5 years, if we sit here and be like, that sucked too, let's change it again. We have the power to do so. And I think that put the power back in our hands, knowing that our votes do matter.
Yeah, no, it felt good to see that with the election results, and a figure I saw today that the biggest demographic of voters were the 40 to 60-year-old Americans of our generation, that we came up, through the Reagan administration, we came up through the 80s and the 90s, and we saw all the drama overseas, and we saw the global war on terror. We saw recessions, we've seen enough of it. We're not too old, and we're not too young not to have had any trauma from that. And I mean, America spoke, man. It was it was good to see, and I agree with you. We better see some significant flips, and I don't think it's hard to make a significant flip. I mean, there's a couple things we could do right south of you that isn't rocket science. I think we were there 4 years ago because I saw it starting in motion when I was on the border myself doing some work. And let's see and cross our fingers for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, brother, again, thank you so much. Thank you again for gracing us with your presence and your expertise on the subject.
Always good to see you, Vince. Thanks for having me on. It's an honor. I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Yes, sir. Later, brother. Thank you for listening to Borderland and Ironclad Original. Don't forget to like and share and tell your friends. Also, if there's any guests or topics you'd like me to cover, please put those in the comments and we'll do our best to get them to you.